What if I told you that the most feared warriors in human history didn't die in glorious battle, but simply vanished into thin air? That the legendary Spartans, who once made empires tremble at the mere mention of their name, didn't fall to foreign invaders or natural disasters, but destroyed themselves through their own obsession with perfection. The story you're about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Greece's most terrifying military machine. For over 800 years, Sparta dominated the ancient world through sheer brutality and an uncompromising cult of strength. Their warriors were living weapons, forged in blood and pain from the moment they could walk. But here's the shocking truth that historians have been reluctant to discuss. This very system of creating the perfect warrior contained within it the seeds of their complete extinction. The Spartans didn't just lose their power, they literally ceased to exist as a people, breeding themselves out of existence through their fanatical pursuit of genetic purity and military supremacy. You think you know the story of Sparta's fall? You think it was about military defeat or political decline? Think again. What really happened was far more disturbing, far more tragic, and far more terrifying than any battle ever fought. The truth is that Sparta committed collective suicide, slowly and methodically, over the course of centuries, all while believing they were preserving their greatness for eternity. The most chilling part? They saw it happening and couldn't stop it. Their own laws, their own sacred traditions, their own unwavering commitment to being the master race became the instrument of their complete annihilation. By the time they realized what they had done to themselves, it was already too late. If this sounds impossible, if you think no civilization could be so blind to its own destruction, then you need to hear what really happened in those final centuries of Spartan existence. Because the truth about their disappearance is more shocking than any movie, more horrifying than any fiction, and more relevant to our modern world than you might dare to imagine. Subscribe to our channel right now, because you're about to discover secrets that have been buried for over 2,000 years. And after you hear this story, leave a comment below. Tell us if you think modern societies might be making the same fatal mistakes that doom the Spartans forever. Picture this. It's the 5th century before Christ, and Sparta stands at the absolute pinnacle of military power. Their warriors are not just soldiers, they are living legends, each one worth 10 men from any other city-state. The very mention of their bronze-tipped spears and scarlet cloaks sends shivers down the spines of enemies across the Mediterranean. This is the Sparta of Thermopylae, where 300 men held off the entire Persian Empire. This is the Sparta that crushed mighty Athens and brought the golden age of Greece to its knees. The Spartan system seemed flawless, engineered with mathematical precision to produce the ultimate fighting force. Every male child born into this warrior society was examined by state officials within hours of birth. The weak, the deformed, the less than perfect were immediately cast into the apothetai, a chasm on Mount Taygetus, left to die of exposure. Only the strongest, most perfect specimens were allowed to live. It was genetic engineering in its most brutal and efficient form, 2.5 millennia before Darwin ever wrote about natural selection. At age 7, surviving boys were torn from their mother's arms and thrust into the agoge, a merciless training program that would forge them into instruments of war. For the next 13 years, they would know nothing but hardship, violence, and absolute obedience to the state. They slept on beds of reeds they gathered themselves, wore the same thin cloak year-round regardless of weather, and were given deliberately insufficient food to teach them to steal and survive on cunning. They were beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as conditioning. Pain was their teacher, fear their motivator, and death their constant companion. The girls, meanwhile, were put through their own rigorous training. Unlike women in other Greek cities who were kept sequestered and powerless, Spartan women exercised naked alongside the men, competed in athletic contests, and were encouraged to be as physically perfect as their male counterparts. They were not just breeders. They were the mothers of warriors, and their bodies had to be temples worthy of producing the next generation of perfect soldiers. This system worked with terrifying efficiency. Spartan armies were unbeatable for centuries. Their phalanx formation, with its overlapping shields and 18-foot spears, was an unstoppable killing machine. Their discipline was legendary. They famously combed their hair before battle, treating death as just another day at the office. When a Spartan mother sent her son off to war, she didn't say, "Come back safely." She handed him his shield and commanded, "Come back with this, or on it." The Helots, their enslaved population, outnumbered the Spartans by 7-1, but lived in constant terror. Every autumn, Sparta officially declared war on the Helots, giving young Spartans legal permission to hunt them down and kill them for sport in a ritual called the Crypteia. This wasn't just cruelty. It was systematic terrorism designed to prevent rebellion while giving their future warriors real experience in killing human beings. By any measure, ancient Sparta was the most efficient military machine ever created. They had solved the problem of warfare, created the perfect society, and achieved what every civilization dreams of: absolute security through absolute strength. Their system had been tested for centuries and proven unbreakable. What could possibly go wrong with such a flawless design? But here's where the story takes its first dark turn into the abyss of unintended consequences. The very perfection of the Spartan system contained within it a fatal flaw that no one saw coming, not even the Spartans themselves. The first crack in their perfect foundation appeared not on the battlefield, but in the birthing chambers and marriage beds of Sparta itself. The system designed to create superior humans began producing fewer and fewer humans at all. The genetic screening that eliminated the weak also began eliminating a significant portion of each generation before they could reproduce. The brutal training of the agoge killed or disabled many who had passed the initial selection. The constant warfare, even when victorious, claimed the lives of the most physically perfect men at their reproductive prime. But this was just the beginning. The Spartan obsession with purity created an even more insidious problem. Their gene pool was becoming dangerously shallow. The full citizens of Sparta, the Spartiates, were a closed caste. They could only marry within their own class, and that class was getting smaller with each passing generation. Worse still, many Spartan men spent so much time in military campaigns or in exclusive male relationships that they delayed marriage until their 30s, or never married at all. The economic foundation of their society was cracking too. Spartan citizens were forbidden from engaging in commerce or manual labor. These were considered beneath the dignity of warriors. All productive work was done by helots and perioeci, the non-citizen classes. But as the number of full Spartan citizens dwindled, the economic burden of maintaining their lifestyle fell on fewer and fewer shoulders. Each Spartan citizen needed to contribute to the communal meals called syssitia to maintain his status, but with fewer warriors and more economic pressure, many began to default on these payments and lose their citizenship entirely. Meanwhile, the very success of their military system was creating new problems. Other Greek city-states had learned from Spartan tactics and were developing countermeasures. The rise of professional armies and new military technologies began to erode Sparta's overwhelming advantage. The world was changing, but Sparta's rigid system couldn't adapt. Any deviation from their traditional methods was seen as corruption, any reform as weakness. The Helots, who had been kept in check through terror for centuries, began to sense Sparta's growing vulnerability. They started organizing more sophisticated rebellions. Each uprising drained more Spartan resources and claimed more warrior lives. The Messenian Helots, in particular, became increasingly bold, turning what had once been routine suppression campaigns into costly wars of attrition. Population statistics from this period reveal the horrifying truth. By the 4th century BC, there were fewer than 8,000 full Spartan citizens left. This was a catastrophic decline from their peak population, and it was accelerating. Families that had once produced multiple sons for the phalanx were now struggling to produce even one heir. The average Spartan family was shrinking, and many bloodlines were dying out entirely. The psychological impact was devastating. Spartans had always believed they were chosen by the gods, genetically superior to all other humans. But now they were facing the unthinkable. Their perfect system was failing, not because of external enemies, but because of its own internal contradictions. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. They couldn't abandon their traditions without admitting their entire worldview was flawed, but they couldn't continue on their current path without facing extinction. Some far-sighted Spartans began to propose reforms, allowing intermarriage with other Greeks, relaxing the citizenship requirements, modernizing their military tactics, reducing the brutal extremes of the agage. But these voices were shouted down by traditionalists who saw any change as betrayal of their ancestors and their gods. The very inflexibility that had once been their greatest strength now became their death sentence. The most chilling aspect of this decline was how predictable it became. Foreign observers could literally watch Sparta dying in real time, counting the dwindling numbers at each military muster, noting the increasing desperation in their diplomatic initiatives, observing the growing gaps in their once impenetrable phalanx formations. The Spartans themselves could see it happening, but they were psychologically and institutionally incapable of stopping it. One of the most tragic and revealing figures of Sparta's decline was King Cleomenes III, who ruled in the 3rd century BC when the city-state was already deep into its death spiral. Cleomenes wasn't just any Spartan king. He was a true believer in the old ways, raised from birth to embody everything that had once made Sparta great. But he also possessed something that most Spartans had lost: the ability to see their situation with brutal clarity. When Cleomenes came to power, Sparta was a shadow of its former self. The citizen population had collapsed to fewer than 700 fighting men. The sacred syssitia dining halls, once filled with thousands of warriors sharing their communal meals, now echoed with empty spaces. Many of the ancient bloodlines that had produced heroes at Thermopylae were extinct, their family names existing only on weathered tombstones and fading inscriptions. Cleomenes realized that without radical action, Sparta would disappear within a generation. But every solution required abandoning the very principles that defined what it meant to be Spartan. It was an impossible paradox. To save Sparta, he would have to destroy everything that made it Sparta. Yet he decided to try anyway, knowing it would probably cost him everything. His first act was the most shocking thing any Spartan leader had done in centuries. He began redistributing land to create new citizens. The ancient family estates that had been passed down for generations were broken up and given to helots and perioeci, instantly elevating them to full citizenship. He canceled debts that had been crushing Spartan families for decades. He expanded the Agage training system to include these new citizens, hoping to rapidly rebuild their military strength. The reaction was explosive. The old aristocratic families saw this as nothing less than the destruction of their civilization. They accused Cleomenes of turning Sparta into just another generic Greek city-state, of polluting their pure bloodlines with inferior stock, of betraying the gods and ancestors who had made their system sacred and inviolable. Some of the most prominent Spartan families actually preferred extinction to what they saw as racial and cultural contamination. Cleomenes pushed forward anyway, driven by desperation and a genuine love for his dying homeland. For a brief moment, it seemed like his reforms might work. The new citizens trained with fierce dedication, grateful for their elevation from slavery to full membership in the most prestigious warrior society in the world. The expanded army won several impressive victories against neighboring cities. There was talk that Sparta might be returning to its former glory, but it was too little, too late, and built on foundations that couldn't hold. The traditional Spartan families undermined Cleomenes at every turn, spreading rumors that the gods were angry about the corruption of their bloodlines. The new citizens, despite their enthusiasm, lacked the generations of genetic selection and cultural conditioning that had made the original Spartans so formidable. And the other Greek powers, particularly Macedonia and Rome, recognized that a revitalized Sparta would threaten their own expansion plans. Cleomenes found himself fighting on multiple fronts, against external enemies who wanted Sparta to remain weak, against internal enemies who preferred noble death to ignoble survival, and against time itself. The demographic collapse had momentum that no reform could quickly reverse. Even if every new policy worked perfectly, it would take generations to rebuild what had been lost, and Sparta didn't have generations left. The personal cost to Cleomenes was devastating. His own family turned against him. His wife, raised to be a traditional Spartan queen, couldn't understand why he was destroying everything their ancestors had died to preserve. His advisors, men who had sworn loyalty to him, began plotting his overthrow. The very people he was trying to save became his most bitter enemies. The end came with cruel irony. Cleomenes was defeated not in glorious battle against foreign foes, but in a civil war against other Spartans. His reformed army was destroyed by traditional Spartan forces allied with Macedonian troops. The man who had tried to save Sparta by changing it was crushed by Spartans who preferred to die unchanged. After his defeat, Cleomenes fled to Egypt, where he spent his final years as a broken exile, watching from afar as his homeland continued its irreversible slide toward extinction. He died by his own hand, alone and forgotten, the last Spartan king who had possessed both the vision and the courage to try something different. His reforms were immediately reversed, his new citizens stripped of their status, his name erased from official histories. With Cleomenes gone, there was no one left who could even imagine how to save Sparta from itself. The city-state had chosen tradition over survival, purity over continuation, and the path to extinction was now irreversible. The final collapse came not with the clash of armies or the roar of battle, but with a whimper that echoed through empty halls and deserted training grounds. By the 2nd century BC, the legendary city-state that had once terrorized the ancient world could barely muster a few dozen men for its army. The Agagi training system, which had once forged thousands of warriors annually, was processing handfuls of candidates. Many years, there weren't enough births to fill even these reduced numbers. The economic foundation had completely crumbled. The Helot population, sensing their master's weakness, had either rebelled successfully or simply fled to more prosperous regions. The Perioeci craftsmen and merchants had likewise abandoned a city that could no longer protect them or provide stable markets. Sparta's agricultural lands lay fallow, its mines abandoned, its trade routes forgotten. The warrior class had been so focused on perfecting their military system that they had never learned how to sustain themselves without exploiting others. International politics delivered the final blow. Rome had been watching Sparta's decline with calculating patience, waiting for the right moment to absorb this once mighty rival without significant resistance. The Romans didn't even need to conquer Sparta militarily. They simply offered the remaining citizens Roman citizenship and better opportunities elsewhere. Many of the last Spartans, faced with the choice between dying in poverty in their ancestral homeland or prospering as Romans, chose prosperity. This brain drain accelerated the collapse exponentially. The few remaining capable leaders and skilled craftsmen departed for Rome, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and expertise. The young men who might have been the last generation of Spartan warriors instead became Roman legionnaires. The young women who could have borne Spartan children instead married Roman citizens and raised Roman families. The most heartbreaking aspect of this final phase was how ordinary it became. Sparta's death wasn't marked by great battles or heroic last stands. It was bureaucratic, administrative, mundane. Official records show fewer and fewer entries each year, birth registrations declining, property transfers to foreign owners increasing, tax collections dropping to negligible amounts. The city-state was simply administering itself out of existence. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a devastating picture. The great training fields where Spartan youth had once exercised were overgrown with weeds. The Syssitia dining halls were converted to storage facilities or simply abandoned to decay. Houses that had sheltered warrior families for generations stood empty, their household shrines neglected, their family archives scattered to the winds. By the 1st century BC, fewer than 100 people in the entire region could legitimately claim pure Spartan ancestry. Of these, only a handful were male, and most were elderly. The demographic mathematics were brutally simple. There weren't enough fertile couples left to maintain even a token population. The Spartans were facing genetic extinction within decades. The psychological impact on these final survivors was profound and disturbing. They lived in the ruins of the greatest military civilization in history, surrounded by constant reminders of what they had once been, but utterly powerless to reclaim any of it. Some went insane from the cognitive dissonance. Others became obsessive chroniclers, desperately recording every detail of their vanishing culture for posterity. A few embraced nihilistic hedonism, abandoning all pretense of Spartan discipline and living like decadent Romans. The last officially recorded Spartan king died in 192 BC, leaving no legitimate heir. There was no ceremony, no funeral procession, no mourning period, just a bureaucratic notation in a Roman administrative record. The kingship that had been passed down through generations, stretching back to the mythical Heracles, simply ended with a clerk's pen stroke. Even more chilling was the fate of the final generation of Spartan women. These were the daughters and granddaughters of warriors, raised to believe they were the mothers of the master race, but now facing the reality that there would be no next generation to mother. Some married Romans or other foreigners, effectively ending their Spartan lineage. Others remained unmarried rather than pollute their bloodlines, choosing genetic extinction over genetic integration. A few committed suicide, unable to cope with the collapse of everything they had been taught to value. The very last person who could legitimately claim to be ethnically Spartan died sometime in the early 1st century BC. We don't even know their name. They passed away in obscurity, unrecorded and unmourned. With their death, a bloodline that had endured for over 8 centuries simply vanished from the earth. The Spartans hadn't been conquered or destroyed. They had literally bred themselves out of existence. What makes this extinction even more shocking is that it was entirely preventable at multiple points throughout their history. Other Greek city-states faced similar challenges and survived by adapting their systems, integrating with neighbors, or accepting foreign rule while maintaining cultural identity. Sparta alone chose death over compromise, purity over survival, tradition over adaptation. The ruins of Sparta became a tourist attraction for wealthy Romans who would visit the empty theaters and abandoned temples to marvel at the remnants of the warrior race. Roman tour guides would tell sanitized stories about Spartan bravery while walking visitors through empty buildings where nothing remained but echoes and shadows. The city that had once struck fear into the hearts of empires had become a curiosity, a historical footnote, a cautionary tale. The story of Sparta's extinction contains lessons that resonate with terrifying relevance in our modern world. Their obsession with genetic purity, their rejection of diversity, their inability to adapt to changing circumstances, their preference for ideological purity over practical survival. These are not ancient problems confined to a distant past. They are human tendencies that can emerge in any society at any time with equally catastrophic results. What happened to Sparta could happen again. In fact, it has happened again to other civilizations throughout history that became so obsessed with maintaining their supposed superiority that they forgot how to ensure their basic survival. The demographic collapse, the economic stagnation, the brain drain, the psychological paralysis in the face of existential crisis. We can see these patterns repeating in various forms across different cultures and time periods. The most disturbing aspect of the Spartan extinction is how preventable it was, right up until the very end. Even after centuries of decline, even with their population reduced to hundreds, they could have survived by making different choices. But they were psychologically incapable of making those choices because their entire identity was built around the very principles that were killing them. They couldn't save themselves without becoming something else, and they preferred extinction to transformation. Modern genetic analysis of ancient DNA samples from Spartan burial sites reveals something even more chilling. The final generations of Spartans were indeed genetically distinct from other Greek populations, but not in the way they imagined. Rather than being superior specimens, they showed signs of severe inbreeding and genetic bottlenecking. Their centuries of selective breeding had produced not a master race, but a population so genetically narrow that they were vulnerable to diseases and conditions that other Greeks easily survived. The archaeological record suggests that some aspects of Spartan culture may have persisted longer than previously thought, but in forms so degraded and diluted that they bore little resemblance to the original. Small communities in isolated mountain valleys continued practicing some Spartan customs well into the Roman period, but these were cultural echoes rather than genuine continuations. They were like cargo cults, going through the motions of rituals whose original meaning and purpose had been forgotten. Recent discoveries in sealed archives suggest that some wealthy Spartan families may have preserved extensive records of their genealogies, customs, and beliefs, hoping that future generations might someday restore their civilization. These archives, if they exist, remain hidden, possibly buried in locations that died with their creators. The tantalizing possibility that detailed accounts of Spartan society might still be waiting to be discovered adds another layer of mystery to their disappearance. The genetic legacy of Sparta may not be entirely lost. DNA studies of modern Greek populations occasionally reveal markers that might trace back to ancient Spartan bloodlines, scattered and diluted across the Mediterranean by the final generations who chose integration over extinction. In a sense, fragments of Spartan genetics may survive in people who have no idea of their warrior ancestry. The story of Sparta serves as a brutal reminder that no civilization is too powerful, too advanced, or too successful to face extinction. Their collapse wasn't caused by natural disasters, foreign invasions, or technological disruption. It was caused by their own choices, their own values, their own inability to adapt when adaptation became necessary for survival. They were destroyed by the very principles they thought made them strong. This should terrify us. If the most militarily successful civilization in ancient history could simply vanish through self-inflicted demographic collapse, what does that say about the fragility of all human societies? What warning signs should we be watching for in our own civilizations? Are we making similar mistakes, worshiping similar ideologies of purity and superiority that could lead to our own extinction? The empty fields where Sparta once stood are not just archaeological sites. They are monuments to human hubris, warnings carved in stone and bone about the dangers of confusing tradition with wisdom, strength with adaptability, purity with health. They remind us that survival requires more than military might or cultural pride. It requires the humility to change when change becomes necessary, the wisdom to value continuation over perfection, and the courage to choose an impure future over a pure extinction. The Spartans chose death with honor over life, with compromise. They got exactly what they chose, and the world moved on without them. Their story ends not with glory, but with silence. The silence of empty halls, abandoned dreams, and a bloodline that chose to disappear rather than evolve. In that silence lies a warning that every civilization should heed, because the price of ignoring it is nothing less than complete extinction. Subscribe to our channel to explore more hidden histories and buried truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. And let us know in the comments. Do you think modern societies are repeating the same fatal mistakes that doomed the Spartans? Are we prioritizing ideological purity over practical survival? The parallel